It's round 6 of Norway chess, and world champion Magnus Carlsen is playing against Shak and Mamedyarov. He's got the white pieces here, and he's looking to bounce back from his defeat yesterday to Vichy Anand. So he kicks off here with knight to f3. We had d5 from Shak, and now pawn g3 from Magnus. He loves to fianchetto the bishop lately. He's so well prepared in these lines. So pawn g6 now from Shak. Both players developed the bishops. Pawn d4 from Magnus. Knight f6. Both players now castled, and Magnus strikes with pawn to c4 here. Shak goes c6 to support his centre, and now different options for Magnus. You can go pawn b3, for example, as a very main move, but Magnus goes knight to c3. Shak takes on c4, main way to play, and now again different options for white. You can go knight to e5, pawn a4. Magnus sets up with pawn e4 here. He claims the big centre, but Shak now plays to immediately undermine it. He goes bishop to g4, and after pawn h3 from Magnus, he gives that bishop pair up, chops off the knight, but this is his idea. He achieves e5 very quickly, striking at Magnus's centre. So Magnus takes on e5, best move. The knight now drops back to d7, preparing to recapture, but Magnus doesn't want the black pieces to develop so harmoniously, so he flicks in this e6 move, shatters the black pawn structure now, and in compensation for being a pawn down, that's one of his trumps, plus he's got the bishop pair here. So the bishop now came to e3 developing, stops a knight from coming to c5 immediately. Queen e7 from Shak. Now this bishop nudged back to g2, and Magnus wants to free up the queen from babysitting it, go to e2, then pick up that c4 pawn. So Shak now goes knight to a6, completing his development. Queen e2 from Magnus, and now you don't want to go pawn b5, start trying to hold on to that pawn, or then white can go a4, and you're just undermining the whole structure, plus e5 is coming. If you go b4, it's no good after this. Still your pawn is dropping, and if you drop the knight back here, which is the best move, then we can take here, pawn recaptures, e5, and black's best here is to actually give up an exchange. If you try and move the rook, then white can take on a7. So you don't want to try and hold on to this c4 pawn. Shak instead went knight to b4 here, and now he's about to fork Magnus on c2. Did Magnus react by moving the rook there? Well, no. He took on c4 here, allowing this move, but can you see Magnus's brilliant response here? And if you're enjoying this video, do hit that like button, really helps me out. And the move that Magnus now played here is knight to d5. So he opens up this attack on the knight here, and you don't have time to take either rook or bishop, or then you lose your queen with check. That's the problem. So instead this knight was captured. Now you don't want to be taking with this pawn here. Looks like it might be nice to repair your structure, but then after Magnus takes on c2, if Shak went d4, which we saw in the game, well, now you can actually capture this one, because after bishop takes, there's queen c4 check. That's the problem with taking with this pawn. You open up the king. So that's why Shak actually took this knight with the other pawn here. Magnus took on c2, and now he pushed d4. He kicks back this bishop. It comes to d2 because Magnus wants to activate via b4 later on if possible. So rook c8 from Shak. The queen now came to b3, hits both of these pawns, but knight c5, excellent defensive move, also hits the queen. Why is Magnus giving these tempos? Well, now he comes to a3, an annoying square, pressuring the knight, and it can't move away because the queen is pinned behind it. So queen d7 was played, stepping out of that pin. Magnus brought a rook to the c-file, pressuring the knight. It was defended with b6. And now here's a really instructive moment. Again, if you want to pause, think about how you might play as white. What's so instructive here is that white has the bishop pair. So how do you continue playing with that? Well, you want to open up the position, get your bishops raking across the board. This one's actually a bad piece right now, staring at its own pawn. So you can start with f4 here or rook f to e1, but Magnus goes much more direct, pawn to e5. He's actually sacrificing a pawn which Shak takes, but look at how he's now opened up that monster light squared bishop. So rook f to e1 from Magnus. He hits the bishop on e5. It dropped back to g7 here, and now more energetic play, pawn b4, building up a great initiative here. Now you don't want to be dropping the knight back here and into d6, because then you lose on a7. So knight a4 is pretty much forced. Shak also could have considered taking the queen there, and after this one hit a4, Magnus took on c8, the rook recaptured, and then he nudged over to b3, pressuring this pawn here with rook and queen. And Shak now responds in the best manner. If you go passive and defend this pawn, well, for one thing it looks a bit ugly, but for another, white could actually crash through here. Black would have to take back, then bishop d5, and if you defend with the king, well, white can actually liquidate here, pick up the knight on a4, and white just retains pressure in this position. King safety is key, black is more exposed, plus there's pressure down here. The queen could be invading if black's not careful, so it's better for white. But we didn't have this one from Shak. He didn't go rook to e8. Instead, he jettisoned that pawn. He went knight c3 here, lets Magnus pick up the pawn back, king h8, but okay, the material's only level at this point, and he's got a wonderful knight on c3, still a balanced game here. So Magnus now goes king h2, tucks his king away, rook e8 from Shak, looking to exchange that powerful rook. So Magnus chops off, the queen recaptured, and now he plants his queen on c4, and it's just a little bit uncomfortable for black. Yes, white's got the bishop pair, but also there's the king safety piece. The queen might be invading. So Shak gives himself room with pawn h6, although pawn h5 was actually a bit more accurate there. Stops Magnus from ever going h4, h5, and also doesn't leave this one as a tactical liability in any future lines. So a3 from Magnus, he just covers his weakness. And now it's tough here to play for Shak. You can't really leave your back rank. How do you stir up any kind of play? Well, Shak goes a5, a nice idea here, because after Magnus captures, which is what he played, the pawn recaptures, he's got this idea now of queen f8 hitting both of these pawns, and Magnus actually allows it. This is really beautiful understanding. He goes bishop to f1, again playing actively. He understands how to use his bishop pair, and after the queen hits both pawns, he defends this one with the king. Shak comes to e4 with the knight, hitting bishop, hitting f2 pawn. Magnus tucks back to cover, and now he loses a pawn on a3. But what Magnus has foreseen is that he builds up a great initiative now, and he'll be winning this one back with advantage in just a moment. So he starts with bishop to d3 here. He kicks this knight into d6, hits the queen. That one now came to a6, hits the knight some more, pressures the a5 pawn, plus the bishop hits here. So Shak now came to f5, he covers the pawn from the bishop, and now although Magnus could take this one here, this is actually a blunder because then you lose your bishop on d3. So he has to keep an eye on that bishop. He first goes pawn to h4, he doesn't yet capture on a5 here. This is a big threat to go h5, that's why Shak would have been better going h5 earlier. Then the knight is undermined, so Shak pushes to defend that one, and now Magnus picks up on a5, restores the material balance. So king h7 from Shak, Magnus unpins his queen, pressures the knight on f5. The queen came back defending here, and now queen d5, wonderful centralizing move. But is white actually going to break through here? Materials level, and Shak does have a passed pawn here that Magnus has to keep an eye on. So the queen came to d6, looking to exchange. Magnus ducked back, he wants to keep attacking chances, pressures this knight again. Queen to e5 defended, hits the bishop on a5, it bounced into d8, and now Shak just goes queen e6, waiting on the position. You can't yet go bishop f6 there, trying to trade things off. There's too many tactical problems. But here Magnus has to find a plan. So he starts with queen b7, pinning that bishop, but the knight hopped to d6, pressures the queen, it came back to c6. This one's now pinned here, and at this point Shak was getting really low on time, but he's still okay. He should do something like bishop to f6 here, trying to exchange, and it's not obvious how white continues. Say you go bishop to b6, well, you could do bishop e5, waiting. How is white breaking through? What Shak did in the game, though, was an immediate blunder in this position here, queen to b3. So he's going after this bishop. If Magnus takes here, Shak will take here. He's doing fine. But what he either overlooked or didn't assess correctly was Magnus's tactical shot. Pause if you want to look for it. Magnus can snap off on g6 with check. And after the king recaptures, then he takes here with check. He's won a pawn. Now after the king retreats, queen d7, pinning this bishop, perhaps what Shak thought from afar, low on time, was that this d-pawn was actually giving him enough play. But if he now goes pawn d3, well then simply bishop f6 wins the game. You can't actually come back onto this diagonal, of course. You'd have to cover like this, and the endgame is just completely lost after a sequence like this. You pick up on the h-file, you have to block that one, and white can actually just liquidate here, completely one pawn endgame. So this is the problem for Shak. You can't push the d-pawn. Now he's backpedaling, trying to defend. So he goes king to g6, steps out of the pin, but now Magnus can start checking. The king came to f7 here. If it sits on h7, we get very similar lines. Magnus now comes queen c5, pressures the h5 pawn, threatens to take with check. You can't go d3 here, we're picking up. There's too many problems. Then the queen can actually come back to corral this pawn. Plus this bishop can come here, cover the d2 square. So we didn't have d3 from Shak. He goes queen b7 check. Magnus covers with f3 here. King to e8 was played, hits that bishop. It came to c7 now, preparing to come to f4 in some lines. Queen b2 check played, king h3. The pawn came to d3, but it's just not in time here. Magnus picks up with check, king d7, queen f7 check. The king came to c6, and this was actually the final move. Shak resigned here. There's really just not a lot he can do. For example, Magnus can go queen to c4 check here. After the king moves away, well then bishop f4, you cover this pawn, and if you try and advance it, well we can just check, then pick up the pawn. If you don't advance it, well white's going to slowly win the position. These pawns are three connected passes, the game's completely gone. So a beautiful crush by Magnus, excellent use of the bishop pair. If you want to see another amazing game between these two players, then click here. Thanks for watching, see you soon.